They started after they closed or before they closed.
Don't they still have plastics, that plastic store still there? Or is that
Oh yeah, Tap Plastics.
Tap
is still
Plastics,
there.
yeah.
I like those.
That was cool. They had those. Do you know when your festival costs 30 squares?
Well, they can make whatever you want.
Yeah, but I mean that's what I came there for because my middle school had a lead in their water supply, so they had to bring water, so they actually bring your own cup. It was bad because of some trees growing there. They didn't push the pipe. Oh, now we got lead. We can't drink.
Yeah.
Let's bring water.
That was all they did.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, they didn't plan for the tree to grow that big. Like, if you look at the place, it's like a small tree. Yeah, I mean, it's like, oh, it's a small tree. Let's keep watering it. Nothing bad will happen. And then boom. Like, all of us, like, just get up.
Yeah, my dad.
This is the microphone.
Let's put it this way. I like trees when I don't have to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, he loves landscaping and archery and all that.
So in the spring? Yeah.
I'm having for like 16 years.
I could see, that's a legitimate deal.
Will you be writing anything on them?
No. Thank you.
One here and one right. Yeah, I just hadn't done a lot of that stuff. With Watts. Yeah, the three of us, right? Yeah, that was really awkward. Well, transfer split off, and like our group just got smaller and smaller as we made our way to Darwin.
Yeah, there was the guy that came to College of Marin, and then I remember him saying, yeah, I think we're supposed to set up all for like GE classes for the spring. I was thinking,
How's that in March?
yeah, that's like instead of information. And then I haven't seen him this semester.
Wow.
He sort of disappeared.
You've never actually done that then.
Well, I mean,
He's a GE major.
I was saying, yeah, just to have a GE names.
Yeah. Stay calm.
Wait a couple of minutes until it's noon.
That's not like what we do player.
Actually,
Oh, yes.
Okay. Oh, you want that? Okay. Sorry.
just to raise my eyes.
You want to ask something? Huh?
Ask you Russian. I'm sorry, did you speak Russian? Russian is Russian? You were speaking. Yes, you were speaking. Yeah, right. Americans say Russian, but it's Russian. That's the thing. I don't understand. They're like empanadas in Spanish. This one is an unusual shape. Looks like a pie or something.
I was like, I don't think that. I know what it was. All I know is Costco.
Anybody else following that?
No, I think that's it.
Oh, Andrew might be coming.
Well, my esteemed colleagues, other professors are fashionably late as usual. Not one of them is here. Well, in case you don't know it, next week and the week after we are going to have not colloquia, but we'll have the presentations. Students will make presentations of their research. Some of you may even be doing that, right? So that's next week and the week after that. And of course, the semester ends, as everything must end. Which I see smiles springing up on all faces. And then the next colloquium will begin in the beginning of September. So if you want me to invite some famous people that you admire, I'll be glad to do that. So, instead of waiting for anybody else to show up, let's begin. I have the pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Engle, who got her doctorate at UC Davis, and is on the faculty of Computer Science at USF, University of San Francisco. And she'll be telling us about one of the most difficult vulnerabilities of them all, which is insider threats. Let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be a little bit more abstract, but a lot of it is backed by some formal models. So the motivation here is much of the tools that we have right now in security is really focused on protecting our resources from outside attack. People who we don't know, we don't trust, trying to gain access to our resources. That includes firewalls, intrusion detection, and so on. But there's this huge other problem, which is the protecting resources from an insider attack, from looking within our organization, people who have made it through the firewalls, made it through the intrusion detection, that are on our own networks, that are trusted by our systems. How do we still protect our resources? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that particular problem, where we're sort of looking at the problem within an organization, within their networks. So the concept of insider threat is fairly easy to understand. We have trusted people inside of our organization that are misusing their privileges to perform undesirable actions of some sort. You can think of, for example, a lot of the WikiLeaks cases. These are people who are trusted with sensitive information, and they do something that the organization did not want with that information. The problem with insider threat, though, is beyond that. It becomes really, really difficult to precisely define what the problem is, who are the people we're looking at, who do we actually consider as insiders, and then how do we actually measure this threat? How do we say this organization is X vulnerable to an insider attack? So a little bit of the outline of what I'm going to talk about today is we're going to start about exploring a little bit more the difficulties in defining and modeling insider threat. And then we're going to talk about our approach for doing this, where we use this policy-based approach for really defining and focusing what is the problem that we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to use this attribute-based group access control to actually try and measure this threat within an organization. And we'll talk about where we're taking this work right now and a little bit of conclusion. So let's actually really talk about how do we define insider threat and what are the problems that we come up across when we try to do this. So the simplest definition of what insider threat is we start with a set of resources. Okay, it could be servers, could be printers, could be any sort of device that we're trying to protect on the network. And we add to this a whole bunch of users. Okay, users who want access to these particular resources. And then we draw a security perimeter. And what we say then is on one half of the security perimeter, that's our insiders. Those are the people we trust with access to our resources. On the other side of our security perimeter, those are our outsiders. Those are the people that we, in this particular problem, aren't going to be worrying about. We're really only looking at the insiders. And the idea here is all of our insiders, they have direct access to our resources. Whereas any outsider is going to have to go through some sort of really highly protected gateway into our network. So all of these people are going to have to go through the gateway to access our resources. So this is the idea behind insider threat, is either we're looking at the outsiders or we're looking at the people on the inside of the security perimeter. There is a huge issue with this, though, and that it's way too simple. So we really don't have well-defined security perimeters anymore around our networks. We have wireless, we have remote access, we have contractors that maybe need a lot of access to our internal resources, we have our customers. it's a really, really porous perimeter anymore. And especially with more mobile devices growing and accessing our internal networks, we can't really draw a line anymore between what is an insider and what is an outsider. So this sort of binary notion that we can call one set of people insiders and one set of people outsiders doesn't really match the reality of today's organizations. So alternatively, what people try to do is they try to define an insider based on certain sets of attributes and try to get away from this notion of a security perimeter. So they may say that an individual that is trusted and has access and knowledge of the organization, those are insiders. And a lot of these definitions always have these three things: trust, access, and knowledge. And then the insider threat in these terms is whenever an insider misuses the trust, access, or knowledge that they have to perform some sort of undesirable actions with our particular resources. Now, this is a fine definition, and we can really understand what is going on with insider threat from this definition, and really what the problem is. We have these people that have some level of trust, that we're depending on them to not misuse what we've given to them with respect to our resources. The issue here is that these are really hard things to define. How do we actually define trust? How do we say, who do you trust? And again, we run into this problem. It's not just, I trust one person and I do not trust another person. So we have a difference between, say, just people who are in our organization or people who have a really high security clearance. So it's sort of a more continuum of trust. And then we also have a difference between who the organization trusts and who our systems trust. And they're actually very, very different things. So depending on the perspective, we have to define trust differently. And then how do we define access specifically? Are we talking about just physical access to our resources, local access to our resources, remote access to our resources? When you start taking away the fact that, if you just look at remote access to your resources, you're really not looking at your insiders anymore. You're really not looking at the people who have physical access to your devices. And those resources then are going to be completely unprotected. And then how do we define knowledge? And how much knowledge is required for you to actually be considered an insider? So as a brand new employee that has the trust and the access of the organization, have enough knowledge to be considered an insider? Or what about an ex-employee? So now we really, really need to talk about how precisely do we try to define these things, or do we even consider these things when we start talking about insider threat? And I want to really just focus on just the issue of trust, as this is one that is always present in a lot of these definitions. It has to be someone we trust. So from an organizational perspective, we can maybe look at trust as being anybody that's employed by the organization. So, okay, we trust all of our employees. But then maybe we trust more people in senior management positions. We give them a lot more power and a lot more access to our resources. Or what about people who have high security clearance? Does that somehow represent how much our organizations trust these particular individuals? When we take this and look at it from a systems perspective, systems don't care about people. They only care about accounts. So if you can properly authenticate to one of the user accounts on a system, you're trusted by the system, period. Doesn't matter who is actually doing the authentication. Now, on systems, you also have different levels of trust there, too. Like a root or administrator account is going to be trusted way more than, say, a guest account. So trust is kind of a big problem for us. It's hard to measure. It changes based on perspective. And furthermore, we also have the problem with transitivity of trust. So suppose we have Alice, who is an employee and trusted by our organization. And Alice then is trusted to authenticate using her user account and to protect her own login credentials. So the account Alice is trusted by the system. The person Alice is trusted by the organization. Now, say Bob, Alice's husband, or anybody else close to Alice, they can maybe easily get access to those login credentials, either guess them or, if they live in the same home, they can actually have, if you're doing like RSA, the actual key devices. So then maybe Bob can log into these systems as Alice. Bob, logged on as Alice, is going to be trusted by the system, is going to have all of the access that Alice has. So Bob, we consider in this case, is a masquerader. So then the question becomes, when we talk about insider threat, do we actually consider masqueraders as insiders? Because this really depends on what perspective do we take when it comes to trust. Are we taking a systems perspective, where Bob is actually being trusted because he's logged onto Alice's account? Or do we take the organizational perspective, where Bob, since he's not trusted by the organization, then he shouldn't be considered when we talk about insider threat? So there's the question of, well, maybe Bob should not be considered an outsider. He's not trusted by the organization. But what about other employees getting access to Bob's credentials? Then what about maybe a competitor? They're going to have the knowledge. They won't have the trust of the organization, but if they can get into the systems, they will be trusted by the systems. And then we can keep taking this like further and further steps out. How far does this trust extend? So we could have a random person that steals the login credentials and logs in as Alice. Do we have to consider all of these people as insiders? Because pretty much what ends up happening is this encompasses all outsiders. So we pretty much have to think about everybody and protecting our resources from everybody. And if we could do that, we would be doing that. So we have to narrow the scope of the problem. So our proposal for trying to deal with insider threat, when we actually have to create these specific definitions, identify specific people who are considered insiders, is we're going to do this with respect to a resource, not an organization. We're going to look at a single resource, and we're going to say who's an insider with respect to this resource. And then we'll only focus on the high-value resources of this particular organization. Then we're going to focus on who the users are that have access, and then we're going to use access to approximate the trust of the organization in that user. So if this user basically has an administrator account, this organization trusts this user a lot. If this is a guest account, then it's not very trusted by the organization. So we're going to use and focus on just access. But we say that access somehow captures that notion of trust within that organization as well. And then we're going to measure the amount of access that this person has to these resources to come up with a non-binary notion of an insider versus an outsider. We're going to really define this notion of insiderness. How much excess access does this person have to our resources? How much of a threat are these individual people? And we're going to focus on ability and not likelihood of misuse. So just because I say Alice has a very high level of insiderness doesn't mean that Alice shouldn't be trusted by the organization. It doesn't mean that Alice is likely to misuse her privileges. We're just focusing on the actual ability of Alice to misuse her privileges to perform some sort of undesirable actions in the organization. So we're really not looking at sort of the human factors part of this problem. So for us to really go along how we actually do those things, I do need to introduce one of the models that we use for this. And it's called the Unifying Policy Hierarchy, or the Policy and Vulnerability Hierarchy. This started originally with a master's thesis by Adam Carlson, and then it's something that I've been working on as part of my vulnerability analysis framework for my dissertation. The idea here is basically we have different levels of policy. And we focus on policy because policy is basically how we know what is desirable versus undesirable access in our systems. Policy is how we specify the difference between bugs and actual security vulnerabilities. So a bug is just a software bug in the code, and there are lots of bugs in codes. But not all of the bugs are considered vulnerabilities. They're considered vulnerabilities if they have some sort of undesirable consequence with respect to our policy. So we decided, okay, we're going to focus on policy here. But policy has many, many different levels of policy. We have the ideal policy, which is basically what should be authorized in a perfect world with whatever resources we needed. But, of course, that's not realistic. So then we also have the feasible level of policy, where we're making compromises, and we're basically saying, okay, considering the real world, this is what we're going to authorize, and this is what we're going to unauthorize. And then we have the configured policy, and there's always, whenever you have a gap between some sort of statement and it actually being entered on a machine, there are all sorts of opportunities for mistakes to occur or just plain errors happening. So from there, from the standpoint of the systems, we look at what is actually allowed by the security mechanisms of this organization. So that could be what is actually allowed by the firewalls, by the intrusion detection systems, by the individual systems themselves, what are their ACLs or ACMs. That's a configured level. And of course, we still have problems. So even though our systems are configured with a certain set of accesses, there are all sorts of ways to circumvent that based on the implementation. And that's where these vulnerabilities and bugs come into play. So we also have the instantiated policy, which is really saying what is possible. Now, in all of these different areas, we're looking at policy events. So I just want to take a moment and actually talk about what is a policy event. And we think of a policy event as basically a tuple of users, resources, accesses, and some sort of purpose or intent. So users, these can include actual people. So we do need to, at some point in insider threat, look at people. But it also includes their user accounts. It could include processes that are given access. Anything that is given some sort of right in the policy, we're going to consider as a user. And then we have our resources. So our resources could be data, it could be equipment, it could be programs, it could also be users. So you could try and get access to other users' accounts. So we also model users as also resources. And then we think about accesses. And then we also think about this not just in what is allowed by the systems, but we also look at physical access. Who has physical access to these resources? Because once you have physical access to the resources, there is a lot that you can actually do. If you want to, you can chuck the server out of the window, right? So we do have to consider physical access as well. And then we also have this notion of purpose or intent. So we don't just say user A has access to this server. What we really want to say in sort of an ideal sense is that user A has access to this server to do some sort of task for this organization. Okay? And we actually need to model and try and capture what is purpose or intent to understand why we have so much issues with insider threat. So along these lines, to the policy hierarchy, we also give basically kind of a subdomain. Whereas ideal policy, it's going to consider all possible policy events. It's going to consider both people and user accounts. But from the feasible standpoint, machines don't understand users. They don't. They understand users' data, so we could do some sort of like biometrics, but that's still not a person. It's data. So at the feasible level, we have what we consider system-definable policy events. We can no longer consider people, and we can no longer consider intent. And then at the configured level, we have actually what is defined by the systems, by the actual mechanisms. And then finally, at the instantiated level, we consider everything again. Okay, so user account A has access to server. Well, who has access to that user account? We really have to bring in then, again, people. And as soon as we bring in people, we're looking at all possible policy events, not system-definable policy events. So let's go through an example scenario. Let's suppose Alice is a doctor, and as a doctor, Alice should be authorized to be able to read all of her patient records for the purpose of treatment. She can't sell these records to insurance companies or just read up on personal data of her patients. She only has access to these records so that she can treat her patients. That is the only purpose, the only intent that she has this access authorized for. And let's say she also is able to append to medical records, but not to delete, not to overwrite, not to change anything in the past that's already on those medical records. So that's our scenario. And then our ideal policy is going to be pretty close to that scenario. And the ideal policy is going to describe what events should be authorized basically in a perfect world. What is it that we want? Okay? So we want Alice to only be the only person that can authenticate as a user account Alice. Now, we try to do things to make sure that this we have more confidence in this ability, like making Alice change passwords frequently and use only strong passwords, or maybe use two-factor authentication. But at some point, ideally, we want Alice to be the only person that can ever be authenticated as a user account Alice in our systems. And then the account Alice, in this case, should be authorized to read and to append to the patient records for her patients for the purpose of treatment. And that's basically our ideal statement of policy. Then we have to take this down to the feasible level, where we're looking at what system events are actually authorized. And this is going to be sort of the compromises we make to take something from our ideal policy to something that we can actually implement, something that we can actually enforce. So we can no longer talk about the person Alice. Okay, we can only really talk about Alice's user account. And Alice's user account, we can say, that's fine, we can do this. We can make sure that Alice's user account is authorized to read her patient records. We can say her account is authorized to append to those records. That is completely possible. But it may not actually be what ends up on our security mechanisms. So then we have to look at the configured policy, where we're actually looking at the security mechanisms and looking at the configuration on these mechanisms to see what is actually allowed by these security mechanisms. And so it might be that account Alice is allowed to read to all records and to write to all records. And even though the policymakers may say, Alice should only have access to only her patient's records, when the system administrators have to actually do this, that is a nightmare. Patients come, patients go. When you are on leave, somebody else takes on some of your cases, and are those your patients? You need access to those patient files as well. So maybe when we actually get to the configured level, all doctors have access to all patients' accounts, all patients' records. And maybe say that the appending thing, we really didn't want to have to worry about. We couldn't really manage, so we just are giving them both read access and write access to all of the patients' records. Okay? And then we can take this down one level further and look at the instantiated policy, which are what events are actually possible. So suppose that Bob is actually able to authenticate to Alice's user account, and Alice's user account maybe at an instantiated level may be authorized to read, write, and delete all records just because the way that writing is implemented, she could use the writing to also do deletion. So maybe we have some sort of bug in the way that we're actually implementing those different types of access when we get down to the instantiated level. Now, from these different levels of policy, we can start looking then at the gaps between these levels of policy and understand something about the different types of vulnerabilities we have to deal with when we get into an organization. So we look at these policy gaps. And the first one we call an inherent vulnerability, and that is a gap between the ideal level and the feasible level of policy. It indicates the policy compromises that you're making on purpose to get something that is actually achievable and implementable in your organization. So the policymakers, they have something they want, but they know they can't quite get it exactly. So these are the compromises they choose to make from an ideal to feasible level. This could be caused by limited resources. So nobody spends enough money and time on security. There's always really limited resources when you get to real organizations. There is a limited functionality of the security mechanisms that you actually have. So it may be possible, it may be feasible to implement certain things, but maybe we don't have the resources to those particular mechanisms. So we're going to have to further compromise based on what the resources are that we have in our system. So all of these compromises we capture in this inherent vulnerability. These are the vulnerabilities that unless we get something else, we can't do a whole lot about. But we need to be aware of, because maybe then at sort of a policy level, we can do things to reduce the risk that are caused by inherent vulnerabilities. So for one example, I want to talk about the voter-verified paper audit trails, the VVPATs that are on electronic voting machines today. So the idea of these is that we want voters, when they're voting electronically, to be able to verify what is the vote that they are actually recording on the system. So it prints out this little paper trail for you. It says, okay, your vote was this. Is this correct? So you look at the VVPAT, you say, yes, my vote's correct, and then you vote. And if there is any dispute as to how the voting machine counted those votes electronically, you can take all of these paper trails and count them up. And say, okay, well, our paper trails, they match what the voting machines actually gave to you, so we have high confidence in the actual vote counts. That's why we have VVPATs. Now, unfortunately, these are on a single roll of tape, so the first person that votes is going to be the first vote on the VVPAT, and then it scrolls, and then the next person votes, and then it scrolls, and the next person votes. So from these VVPATs, you can actually match up people to their votes. So no longer do we have the anonymity that we wanted with voting. So we have to choose either or. And this is an example of where they actually made a compromise and said, okay, we have this problem. We're going to make this compromise, though, because we think it's more important that the voters are able to verify their votes and that we have a paper trail. And then we're just going to try to protect like crazy these actual paper trails so nobody else can have access to them. Because if they do, then we break the other properties that we want of our voting systems. So these are intentional compromises that are being made. And then we look at the configuration vulnerabilities. Those are whenever, from the feasible policy to the configured policy, we have some sort of difference. This means either somehow the mechanisms were incorrectly configured, or sometimes that we just had really poorly articulated policies, so our system administrators didn't know exactly how to configure the systems based on what the policymakers wanted. There's all sorts of reasons between the gap of feasible to actually configured that we could have mismatches. So, for example, suppose feasibly we never want our ex-employees to have access to our internal resources. But this is a lot of work to actually keep up on, especially if you have a high turnover rate of your employees. So it may be possible, as configured, that some of your ex-employees still have access to your internal resources. And then finally, we get down to implementation vulnerabilities. This is more what we think of traditionally when we talk about vulnerabilities. Usually the causes of these are some sort of like software bugs or improper assumptions about the operating environment of our security mechanisms. So for example, maybe there's a buffer overflow bug in one of our security mechanisms, and that allows us to circumvent all of the access controls on this mechanism. So we captured that notion of vulnerability in these implementation vulnerabilities. So how does this relate back to insider threat? Well, there's some pros and there's some cons to this way of looking at policy. The advantages are that we can capture policy at many, many different levels of abstraction, a little bit better to match what actually is going on in an organization. We have what we want, we have the compromises we make, we have what's actually configured on our systems, and then we have what's actually possible based on some of the implementation problems that we have with our mechanisms. It captures all of these different types of vulnerabilities, a huge spectrum of vulnerabilities. So we can use this policy and vulnerability hierarchy to really define the scope of our research. Of all of these different types of vulnerabilities, what type are we specifically looking at? Disadvantages are, we call all of these things policy oracles. We have an ideal policy oracle, a feasible policy oracle, a configured policy oracle, and an instantiated policy oracle. First off, if we could figure out the instantiated policy oracle, we would have a lot less vulnerabilities in our systems. That's really hard to do. Even at an ideal level, even if we have access to policymakers, sometimes they have a really, really hard time articulating their policy. So those policy oracles, they aren't very, in practice, very easy to approximate or very consistent. Even at the configuration level, it's sometimes hard to pull what are the actual types of accesses that are allowed on these different security mechanisms. They are all configured differently. So these oracles are really, really hard for us to work with. So what we're going to do when we try to redefine insider threat is we're going to use this policy hierarchy to really define the scope of our problem. And then we're going to turn to a different model to actually try to measure our problem. So basically we're going to say that insiders are those individuals or users that have more access at a configured level than at a higher level of policy. And basically what we're saying here then is those users, we have to trust more because we had to give them more access than we wanted to. So those people have more access than what they needed. They have more ability to misuse that access to do something that we actually don't want at some ideal level of policy. So that's how we actually define insiders. It's really based on the types of access they have at the configured level and then a higher level of policy. That includes the feasible level of policy and the ideal level of policy. And then the size of the gap between these different levels of policy gives us a measure of insiderness. How much excess access do these insiders have? The people that have a lot of excess access, those are the people we want to worry about. Those are the people that we want to focus on. So we can have some sort of sliding scale to a point that we can get to a reasonable set of users to define who are our insiders in the system. And then we're going to limit the scope of all of the policy events that we look at to basically events that are defined in the configured policy. So we're going to look at system-defined policy events. We are going to only focus basically at this point on user accounts. So we're going to say these are the user accounts at the configured level. Then we're going to go to the ideal level and say, should this user account actually have this access? That we need to do just to narrow the scope of the problem. We can't consider all of the people that may have access to these things at an ideal level. It is a huge domain, an ideal level policy. Configured level, that's actually something we may even be able to partially automate. So that's going to be the focus of what we talk about when we're talking about insider threat. We're talking about insiders, people who have more access at a configured level than a higher policy level, and only those users that are defined at a configured level, system-definable users. So let's actually talk about an example of insider threat with respect to this hierarchy. So suppose Alice, that doctor, who should only have access to her own patient records for the purpose of treatment, misuses her access to all of the records. So at a configured level, she has access to everybody's records to read personal info on famous patients. This is actually a problem in hospitals in LA. Well, you'll have people say, oh, some famous person came in. Let's go look at their medical history. Totally violating their privacy. So the access to all of the records, we said that that was unauthorized at the feasible level of policy. But at the configured level of policy, all access was allowed. So we capture that sort of insider attack that's possible there. Or we can look at, instead, the ideal versus configured levels. I mean, we can say that Alice maybe misuses access to just her patient accounts, but she uses this information and sells it to insurance companies. So at an ideal level, that is not why we gave Alice access to these records. We only gave her access to these records for the purpose of treating her patients. So at a configured level, we cannot consider purpose anymore. So it is allowed. Any purpose, any reason that she wants access to these patient records, she can do. So then we capture that also notion of insider threat as well. So the way that we're going to go about then tackling the insider threat problem is we're going to examine with respect to a specific resource. So first we're going to identify high-value resources in the organization and really focus on the highest value ones. If we can include other resources in our analysis, we will. But already, just with a couple of resources, it's going to be a heavy-duty analysis. We're going to have a lot of data we're going to have to go through. So we're really only going to focus on the most important resources in an organization. And then we're going to look at what users have configured access to those resources. And then for those users that we identify, then we're going to go back to the policymakers and be like, did you really want this user account to have this type of access to this high-value resource? This is going to involve people and a lot of unautomatable work. Okay? And this is the one part that we can't automate. And then from that, we should be able to figure out basically the insiderness of each individual. How much extra access do they have? We can focus then on only those individuals that have high levels of insiderness. And then we can start thinking about how can we address the threat represented by those individuals. Now, again, we're not saying that they will misuse that excess access. We're saying it's possible that they do. At that point, you might actually want to bring in some sort of human factors people to look at maybe the likelihood that those people would misuse those access. So to do this part, we're going to use these attribute-based groups. So we have this model called attribute-based group access control. It's actually a generalization of role-based access control, where role-based access control, you say, okay, I'm going to define some sort of job function, and that job function has this set of accesses, and then I'm going to assign users to that job function. And that's how we do access control. Well, attribute-based access control is basically the same thing, except for we're defining attributes, not job functions, and saying who belongs to those attribute groups. And we're going to use this model then to identify users with specific types of accesses to specific resources. And I don't want to go into the specific model too much, because there's a lot that goes into it. But basically, we identify a resource. Okay? And then we identify one type of access that we're interested in with that resource. And that resource and that type of access, that gives us an individual resource pair. And then we combine that with other types of accesses that we're interested in. So for a particular resource, we have a bunch of resource pairs. We put those all together, and we create this thing, which we call a resource domain. And then from the resource domains, we combine those together. We get these RD groups. And then what we do from here is we figure out what users belong to this RD group. Now, this is a pre-existing model that we're going to use for insider threat, and basically what we're saying then is all of the people that belong to the user group for this resource domain, those are potential insiders. Those are people that have some level of access to our resources. Now, the next step is to figure out how much extra access do they have to our resources. So the idea here is we're going to create these resource domains, which are basically pairs of high-value resources and types of access that we're interested in. So we may just be interested in looking at read access and how many people have access to this information and could maybe sell it to outside organizations. Or maybe we're really worried about write access or the ability to delete records, and we'll focus on those types of access. Or maybe we're interested in a lot of different ones. It's up to you. We define then those resource pairs, the resource domains, and the RD groups. Once we identify the RD group, we can identify then the associated user group with that RD group, and that gives us the insiders, but not the level of insiderness for each individual person. So from this stage, this is where we actually need to take those users that we identified. We need to query the policymakers and say, how much access was this account supposed to have in some sort of feasible or ideal sense? And from there, we can sort of get an idea of insiderness. Once we have insiderness, then we're only going to focus on people with a high level of insiderness. It's a parameter that we can decide on until we get to a reasonable amount of users to actually look at. And then if we wanted to, and this is optional, we could take those users and model them as resources and see who has access to those user accounts. Now, what that's going to help us do is capture a little bit of the transitivity of trust. One step away. Who has these user accounts are trusted by the system? Who do we trust with access to these user accounts? That will give us a little bit of an idea of masquerading. But how many times can you actually do this before it becomes completely exponential, how many users you have to look at? So it's possible that we can try and do this within the model. It depends on really the feasibility of doing this. And then finally, we repeat the process and combine the results if we decide to do some indirection here. So that's how we actually define insider threat. So just to summarize a little bit here. We're only doing it with respect to a specific resource and different types of access on that resource. We basically pull together these types of accesses and resources that we're looking at. We identify the users that have access to those resources. We identify how much access they have to these resources. That's going to give us an approximation of the configured policy. And then we have to, for all of those high insiderness users, look at the ideal policy level and try to figure out what type of access they should have. And then the gap between that, how much access they have and how much access they should have, will really, really tell us who is the highest threat to our organization when it comes to insider attacks. So we've gotten this far. But what we really, really want to do at some point is we really want to be able to not only implement defenses against insider attack, but determine whether or not these defenses were effective. So one problem right now is that there is a lot that's trying to be done about insider threat, and a lot of that's really invasive to privacy. Really invasive to privacy, especially if you work for government. Does it help? Nobody knows. But what it does do is it makes all of those people really disgruntled. And disgruntled people, higher likelihood of becoming insiders who are going to misuse the access and the privileges that you give to them. So is it actually harming the problem? We want to be able to measure this. We need to be able to measure this at some point. So that's where we're trying to go with a lot of this work. So we've broken this up into several different phases: a model, data, analysis, response, and evaluation phase. The model phase here, that's kind of what I've been talking about a little bit. It's not completely done, but we really are trying to then here rigorously model the insider threat, where the focus is on measurability. We have to have a model where we can actually measure something. What we're going to be measuring is going to be this amount of excess access, and we're really going to narrow the scope of our problem. It's a hard problem to deal with. We're going to just take a slice of it and see if we can do something useful with that part of the problem. That's kind of where the unifying policy hierarchy comes in. Then we're going to have a data phase. And just because we have this model doesn't mean that we know how to actually do the measurement. We need to figure out what exactly are the types of data that we need to be able to approximate the configured policy. How much data do we need to collect? It's not entirely clear that more data is going to mean that we can have more confidence in our results. So we need some sort of analysis at how much data do we need to achieve a certain confidence level, and beyond, if we go below that or above that, how does that change our confidence level in our results? These are approximations. So we are going to have to start thinking about a confidence level. How sure are we that we captured everything we needed to when it comes to approximating these different types of policies? And then we got to figure out how to actually collect this data. So once we figure out what is the data that we need to figure out, can we collect it? Now, some of it may already be available to us. So some of the stuff that we can do with configured policy is we can actually, if we don't have access to the actual configurations of these mechanisms, we can maybe just look at the logs and see who is allowed by these mechanisms to do different things. We may capture a small number of things that at instantiated policy are allowed instead of a configured level of policy, but that goes into our confidence level then. Okay? So look at existing logging tools and develop additional logging tools if we need to try and approximate and automate as much as possible the approximation of the configured policy, because it's the only thing really in this that we can actually automate, and we need to. And then we have the analysis phase. We're actually going to try and deploy these data collection tools and collect data in a realistic environment. We do have some people that are interested in working with us in the medical field and also the facilities field. And then analyze and measure the insider threat, actually do the approximation, figure out what the configured policy oracles are, get all the accesses, all the users, and start querying the policymakers about high value resources with respect and high level insiders. And then analyze and confirm our confidence levels. Seed some insider attacks in there and see if we were able to actually see something going on. And then we have the response phase, where we're going to actually implement the defenses against insiders. We need to do some pre-collection here, then actually implement some defenses against insiders. We could look at more restrictive access controls, but usually if you could have a better and tighter configuration of users' accesses, you would already have done that. So that may not actually be feasible, or maybe we can try and do more monitoring and auditing of the users, which the government likes to do a lot, is increase how much they're actually prying into your personal lives. Or something that we call optimistic access control, where access controls are not set in stone. Whether or not you have access to this resource depends on your previous accesses. And if you start doing something that we think maybe is a little weird, maybe we're going to start and restrict more and more and more the type of access you have and set off some flags so people can take a look at your activity. Once we actually implement these things and deploy them in an environment, we need to recollect our data. We need to now figure out what is the configured policy now that we've made these changes. And then that takes us to the evaluation phase. So we have this data that we've collected at two different stages. We had the level of insider threat in one and the level of insider threat in the other. So let's compare them and let's see if our actual defenses increased or decreased the amount of threat that we had in our environment. If they increased it, then we know that it's not an effective way of doing things. And then rinse and repeat. Based on that, try to change the defenses, remeasure the configured policy, and see if we're getting any better or if we're getting worse, to try and be more effective at how we protect against insider threats in our systems. Now, I did mention that we really don't consider human factors at all, so we're just focused on the ability of people to misuse their privileges. We're not focused on the likelihood they would, but it is well known that the likelihood someone would misuse those privileges tends to increase as you become more and more restrictive of their work environment. So maybe what we can actually do is implement some of these monitoring things that some of the organizations are trying and see if it does increase or decrease the level of insider threat in our organizations. And what we can try and focus then on is only implementing the minimum amount of monitoring that we need to do to actually increase our ability to protect against insider threat and decrease how disgruntled our people in our organization get. So we don't consider very much human factors, but we think that this can have a big impact on human factors when it comes to insider threat in your organization. So to wrap up a little bit here, we are using access to approximate the notion of trust. We aren't considering knowledge at all. We can't really. We don't have a good way of doing that at the moment. We focus only on how the configured access differs from the ideal levels of policy, the feasible or the ideal levels of policy. And then to actually measure this in an organization, we use this attribute-based group model where we measure the access to approximate the actual insiderness of particular individuals. And we then try to identify the highest risk resources and the highest threat insiders to our organization. That's what we have so far as the model goes. These are some of the papers that have some of this information, which will be in the slides for your reference. And the research team, we all 5 of us are continuously working on this problem. We've been working on it since, I want to say, 2006. Sometimes all of us are on paper, sometimes all of us aren't, but we're all basically part of this research group. And there's my contact information. So I should have a couple of minutes for any questions if you have any. Go ahead.
What is an ACM?
Access control matrix. So basically it's saying this user has read access, write access, and execute access. Go ahead.
Have you tried this on any organizations, or is it still in the
We have done really small case studies focused on voting and in the medical world, but based on not real environments and completely hypothetical. So our next step is we do have some people, if we can get funding, who are interested in letting us into their systems and actually query the policymakers and get this information. Go ahead.
Do you plan on being purely analysis, or do you want to go into executing these implementations that you're suggesting?
So my focus is more theoretical on this particular project, but for example, Sean Peisert is really, really interested in actually implementing optimistic access control in an environment and seeing what kind of effect it can have. And also Carrie Gates, who works at CA Labs, they do have a lot of existing monitoring programs. She's really interested in seeing how we can use this to measure insider threat too. Those are our kind of systems people. Any other questions? Go ahead.
So if this work seems to assume that all insider threats are bad, I can see this having kind of a chilling effect on
Whistleblowers?
testimony
Yeah.
and that sort of stuff.
I know. That's a little sensitive, and it's kind of hard for us to avoid this when we start talking about insider threat. Our focus really was to try and convince government that all the monitoring that they're doing isn't doing them any good. All it's doing is making people not be able to do their jobs as well and more disgruntled. But this could also be used by government to justify doing more invasive monitoring as well. And it's kind of something that we're trying to be as ambivalent as possible about. I have no problem with whistleblowers, but most of the organizations do. Go ahead.
I've noticed with Google, I from my home machine, I always get like news. I get stuff that I'm interested in, but if I log in from another computer as an anonymous person,
Right.
I get a whole new, fresh set of things. And it's like, wow, I've been missing all this. And then, so I'm wondering, so they're able to correlate all these logs about my habits and the way I use computers and search and what interests me, even though I don't really want that. I want, broad things so I can really see, other things that I'm not aware of. But they're able to create this ecosystem I set just for me now.
But just for your account.
Not even my account, just that they are able to uniquely identify my computer. Even though I have all this, cookies off and no scripting allowed and all that stuff, because they still have an IP address.
Right.
That. So I'm wondering, have you considered integrating something like that into the logs of what you're doing? So, I was talking to a doctor a little while ago, and he was saying, "Oh yeah, we have a system where if you don't have if you haven't been contacting the hospital for appointments or anything like that, if somebody accesses your thing, then they know whether they're close enough to you, whether they should be accessing you, and that sort of thing."
Absolutely.
And not necessarily restricting their access based on that, but start creating that ecosystem that
Absolutely.
So when they look up something on their work computer, they get other types of things like policy statements or standard statements.
I think it's very related to how we would implement optimistic access control, which is requiring all of these logs and then determining actions based on those logs, including who has access to different resources. I mean, some of those actions that you could do is really just flagging a notification of particular people. We always do have this problem, though, of false positives and false negatives and overwhelming administrators with alerts. It's the same problem that we have with firewalls and intrusion detection systems. So we really have to look at, at what level does the amount of work that we add actually help increase or decrease the risk we have to insiders. But the logs that we're going to be capturing and creating, they can be used for good or for evil, which is very true of a lot of things in security, unfortunately. Okay, well, I think I'm out of time. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, yeah. And you, were you talking about going in? So are you coming here?
I remember
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
About you?
Pretty good. Didn't really complain yet. Well, I could, but wouldn't matter.
Thanks. It was great talking.
Trust someone who already has done your best part. Very interesting.
I'm
Oh, yeah.
I worked here a little while ago. I remember that you were I think you were in
So I got to remember.
Did you apply for it?
See you later.
with Andrew Greenwood. Do you know him too?
No, we don't mind.
He's great.
I did the whole world as a consultant. Previous.
Yeah, I'll be here.
Oh, I should.
I did very much. For Schneider's sometimes mentioned blood, the NSA's definition of trust is when someone can violate a policy without you finding out.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And
Oh, really?
the moment when you started talking about the gap between was it configured and ideal, I started realizing that's the ability to violate a policy at some level, and then the monitoring, being so you can't do it without the organization finding out.
And not only that, that person
So you
can actually protect their domain violation too.
So you end up
By pushing people away or whatever.
you're essentially trusting them less, or not trusting them in a formal sense, as you get a better handle on detecting violations.
Yes, so my life right now is.
Yeah.
Well, I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I love the definition of it. It definitely captures the essence of it. Someone who has the ability to do something technically that you would not want them to do at a policy level. I mean,
It's the same book. I know that.
definition.
Well, yeah. That book is.
You ready to have lunch?
Bye, Andrew. See you later. Roger, did you probably haven't seen it yet? Is there a way that we can configure Seawolf so that if I set up a Git repository, which I know that I can, and I can share it with somebody?
Maybe we can do it on the web.
For sure we could?
Well, I don't have to really ask, this web is kind of historical.
That would be cool. Can you back up web?
And there's also Moonlight.
I don't have access to Moodle.
Let me ask Sophie, ask the department if they mind.
Well, because here's my thought on it. Why don't we have a Git repository for students? We need it. Everybody's using it now. We need it. So if you have a machine that can handle it,
I'm trying to find a machine that can handle more.
I don't mind helping you set it up over the summer or anything too. So
I just looked at the calendars. It was like 1 through 5 was the easiest one.
Good to see you too. What was your name again? Nancy. I'm Matt. Good to see you.
Yeah. First semester here then.
Second.
So you transferred us.
Yeah. And I'm well integrated. I lab assist. I lead a workshop. I grade. The guy who walked out just now and waved to me, not Roger, the last guy, the guy before that, I work for him 10 hours a week in the IT office.
There's a lot of it's like sample questions, so you won't really do an actual test. Pull that insurance question over
The rest was on that was hard.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm not really sure. It's just weird feeling. I don't feel like I don't feel like anything that.
Are you up to the game of life yet, as far as your project? What project are you up to?
We are writing classes.
So the fraction thing? Right? Are you writing a fraction class?
We're writing a class with, to be honest, and understand.
I'm sure that's what it is. You're writing a fraction class because Sujan never changed. Oh, Sujan's gone. Who are you taking it? Oh, you're taking with Mike. Oh, he's great. He's going to go with us tomorrow. Did he tell you that the CS Club here is going to the Computer History Museum tomorrow?
No.
It's in Mountain View. We're all meeting here at 9, and we're going to carpool down together. But anyways, he's going to go with us. So.
Yeah, he didn't mention it. He just mentioned this.
I told him to tell you.
He's great. I like that he's really easy on
Grading?
Not on grading. The grading is tough, but he's easy on the programs and he offers a lot of help. I think it's easy because I have something in Spanish. Can I speak Spanish?
How you doing? Did anybody not get their exam back yet? You did get yours.
Jason.
You got yours.
Yeah.
Yes. You changed the grid on mine, and you said you wanted to get it back, so you put it in the grid book. Okay. I don't know if you did or not.
Not yet.
Okay, anybody else? All right, to continue, I guess, on our ongoing discussion about international economics, and what we're going to do is do some drills. I suppose I could start again with exchange rates, see if I can get it right today, but we won't. We'll come back and visit them. This is the ISLM model with application for the exchange rate, the international aspect of it. And it does pretty much cover Chapter 12. So we'll naturally replay some of our, or replow some of the ground that we've had already. But as we did with the earlier chapter on macro policy and modeling, these models with the ISLM curve, we'll do some of the progression of sort of a chain of events that we expect to have happen that advance either interest rates or retard them or increase growth or reduce growth, and how exchange rates play a role in that.